Narratives about the 1980s are riddled with myths and misconceptions. So in this series, we're going to go deep. We're going to probe places you've never been before and discuss things that series like CNN's The 80s didn't care to mention. I'm Lexual, and together we'll experience the orgasmic highs and disappointing lows of the 80s in 7 episodes. In this series, we'll thrust full throttle into the events, attitudes, people, and legislation that has direct bearings on America today. We'll strip back the myths about America's role in an increasingly globalized world while examining what the 80s meant for people outside of our borders. What can I say? We're gonna do the 80s. I've been waiting to say that for so long. In this episode of Lexual Does the 80s, we'll dive into the state of geopolitics at the start of the decade, and we'll explore how globalization complicated politics, discourse, and lives while Ronald Reagan set his foreign policy. Rewind, pause, and take notes if you have to. But first, a wedding. For the first time in over 300 years, a non-royal British citizen was set to marry into British royalty. The story dominated not just British tabloids, but adoring well-wishers and nosy people worldwide. I'm of course talking about the 1981 wedding of 20-year-old Diana Spencer to 32-year-old Prince Charles, which gathered 750 to 1 billion viewers around their TV sets and roughly 600,000 spectators on the streets of London. Meanwhile, 3,500 VIP guests gathered for the first royal wedding to take place in St. Paul's Cathedral since 1501. This included international guests and dignitaries, even American Ambassador Nancy Reagan. For months before and after the wedding, the event was water cooler fodder that demonstrated how globalized the world was becoming. Plus, it showed the changing tide and what the growing middle class looked for in their news, a smear of politics with a heap of celebrity and gossip. News was faster than ever before and much more accessible. There was a lot of it, and only so much one could focus on. Major events like the wedding of the Princess of Wales and her subsequent paparazzi strolls, fashion influence, and drama would share the stage with a plethora of world milestones and tragedies, from the well-known to the obscure. To really get the 80s in America, we'll have to see what was happening worldwide.
Well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you.
In Congress to work with me and not against me.
So, off the bat, a lot was going on in the first half of the decade. Where does one begin? In 1980, it was announced by the World Health Organization that smallpox had been eradicated. France outlawed capital punishment in September 1981, ending the use of the ghastly guillotine.
It is a sign, perhaps, of how far we have come in this country that today's news of formal recognition between the governments of the United States and the Vatican did not create a furor.
America, who had for 117 years been anti-Catholic, reignited official relations with the Vatican in January 1984. Later that year, in October, the third Prime Minister of India and first and only woman in the role, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her 2 Sikh bodyguards.
Minutes after Mrs. Gandhi's death was confirmed, the Sikhs of Salwar were out on the street to celebrate. They gathered at Britain's biggest Sikh temple to rejoice, as they put it, in the downfall of a tyrant. Do you think that her murder is going to provoke more violence?
I don't care. It is up to them. They started violence, not we. They started, and we have done the same thing to them. I mean, she got what she deserved.
Her legacy, like a lot of people will talk about in this episode and series, is complicated. She helped usher in food self-sufficiency under the Green Revolution, provided refuge for Pakistani refugees, helped establish Bangladesh, and championed the rights of the poor and enacted social welfare programs with populist gusto, while also killing and jailing political opponents, engaging in nepotism, shutting down India's free media for 19 months, finally killing hundreds of Sikh civilians during Operation Blue Star, a 1984 Indian military military attempt to try to take back a temple from Sikh separatists who wanted to break free from Hindu majority rule. After the assassination, thousands of civilians, mostly Sikh, would die during 1984's anti-Sikh riots, which were partly organized by the Indian National Congress. Indian leaders even handed out weapons. Just 3 months after Gandhi's assassination, the country was dealt another blow when, in Bhopal, India, a chemical gas leak at a pesticide plant compromised the health of over 500,000 people, with thousands killed immediately and tens of thousands killed as time went on. The pesticide plant was owned by a corporation with majority ownership held by Americans, with the remaining 49.1% owned by Indian investors. Blame over who caused the incident would be contentious for decades to come. Also in 1984, a BBC report on the ongoing Ethiopian famine aired, penetrating the bubbles of millions of people across the globe. Charities sprung up to raise money, and 36 of the most well-known pop artists convened in a Notting Hill studio to record the smash hit Do They Know It's Christmas to raise money for famine victims. Throughout the early 80s, fundraisers used striking and controversial images of African children to generate Western interest, with critics arguing that such images were dehumanizing and paternalistic. All in the Family star Sally Struthers became the undisputed spokesperson of this genre, which would come to be known as poverty porn. It was meant to guilt Westerners into opening their wallets and would become more relevant in the late 80s.
It's enough to make the angels cry. Now, I can't get used to this any more than you could, but we can get rid of it. Yes, we can. You and I and CCF. I've given 17 years of my life to child care, and I'll give 100 more. But all you have to give is 70 cents a day.
Also during this period, Israel was welcoming approximately 7,000 Ethiopian Jews into its borders through Operation Moses, after an official policy change in 1977. These Ethiopian Jews notably faced discrimination and oppression that they still deal with today. Another 20,000 Ethiopian Jews migrated into the country between 1984 and 1985, fleeing famine and the ongoing Ethiopian civil war between various groups ranging from Marxist-Leninist communists to anti-communists to Eritreans demanding their own sovereign nation. Speaking of civil war, Lebanon was in the middle of a civil war between Palestinian Muslims and Lebanese Christians known as phalanges, which had started in 1975. The United States supported the Lebanese right-wing phalanges and saw the left-wing Soviet-backed Palestinians as a threat. In 1975, after an attempted assassination of Lebanese phalange Pierre Gemayel, phalange gunmen killed 27 Palestinians on a bus, triggering a chain of violent clashes between the groups. Syria sent 30,000 troops in to restore peace, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia joined Syrian forces for a while. In 1978, Israel occupied southern Lebanon to push the Palestinian Liberation Organization away from the borders and to help their allies, the Lebanese phalanges. They withdrew that same year and gave the occupied land to the phalanges, who continued to fight the PLO. In 1982, Israeli troops again invaded the fray to attack the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This was just one of the triggers for Reagan to dispatch Marines to keep the peace without immediately consulting Congress, as required by 1973's War Powers Act. Along with French and Italian forces, the U.S. forcibly resettled civilians and members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with nearly 6,000 of them ending up in West Bank and Gaza. Meanwhile, Israelis and Christian militiamen killed between 2,000 and 3,000 Palestinian civilians in 2 days while backing another president from the Gemayel family, Amin. The next year in the West Bank, approximately 1,000 Palestinians living in the area, many of them schoolgirls, fell ill with mysterious symptoms of nausea, stomach pain, and fainting. Rumors swirled about chemical warfare, with both Palestinians and Israeli leaders freaking out. Palestinians claimed Israelis were trying to drive them out of the area, and Israelis claimed radical Palestinians were trying to incite riots or protests. The West Bank fainting epidemic of 1983 was eventually deemed to be a case of mass hysteria by U.S. and Israeli experts. However, impartial investigations by the World Health Organization denied that this was completely factual. They found that initial reports, quote, might have been caused by hydrogen sulfide from from decomposing waste in pits connected to the toilets of the school where the first outbreak was reported. To make the Middle East even more complex, on September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, and the two countries would fight for the next 8 years, with Reagan supplying weapons to Iraq and backing Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons. Here's Special Envoy Donald Rumsfeld meeting with Saddam in 1983. But lest you think Reagan wasn't two-faced, he also gave weapons to Iran, which of course we'll be coming back to in the second half of the 80s. Iraq quickly learned that Iran wasn't to be fucked with, and within 3 months, Iran had beaten them back to pre-war borders and turned on the offensive. In addition to rolling back new and fragile rights for women through 1979's Islamic Revolution, Iran would spend the 80s bombing Western embassies through proxy militias, like when in 1983 a suicide bomber in Lebanon killed 241 American Marines stationed in Beirut.
The official toll now tops 160 dead and more than 180 wounded, not counting one body that was pulled from the debris while News 4 was on the scene this afternoon.
Reagan initially wanted revenge and didn't want to look weak, especially because there had been an embassy bombing a few months prior that killed 63 people. But due to congressional anger and intense public pressure, Reagan recalled the remaining Marines from Lebanon in 1984, saying he was unwilling to risk another Vietnam by committing American troops to Lebanon. The Lebanese Civil War would continue throughout the late 80s, and roughly 200,000 people would die. 1984 was also around the time that the U.S. clearly began backing the Israeli-propped Gemayel government. It's important to note that the Reagan administration sought an alliance with Israel because it was seen as friendly and democratic in comparison to its neighbors, many of which were allied with the Soviet Union or dealing with some sort of conflict. Take Saudi Arabia. In 1979, it had been changing. There were TVs, women in the workforce, non-Muslim inhabitants, and more secular culture. There were fundamentalists who rejected the new ways, and some were organized under a former military man sickened by the wealth and corruption of the royal family. Al-Otaibi organized hundreds of radical Muslims who entered Islam's holiest shrine in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, taking approximately 50,000 worshippers hostage. The incident, taking place on sacred ground, was unbelievable to many Muslims around the world. Few details emerged because Saudi Arabia blocked off communication. The siege lasted 2 weeks, leaving over 200 dead, and by January, 63 perpetrators publicly beheaded. The royal family, seeing that becoming extra religious and pious would help maintain their power and wealth, made changes for the rest of the 80s. Even though the leaders of the siege were executed, it was believed by many that the monarchy had indeed moved away from real Islam. Saudi Arabia rolled back social reforms, stopped showing women in newspapers and TV, and shut down popular locations like movie theaters and music shops, while also segregating remaining businesses by gender. Women were forced to wear abayas. School curriculum also dropped non-Islamic history and turned up the religion as the country became increasingly extremist and wealthy from its natural oil reserves. In South Korea, a new generation of students and workers called for various changes and freedoms. Back in October 1979, the South Korean president Park Chung-hee was assassinated over dinner. He had seized power and served as dictator since 1961. The assassination was done by the director of South Korea's Central Intelligence, who claimed he had done so because of Park's harsh crackdowns on students who protested the economy. The very next day, martial law was declared. The National Assembly, which functioned like a parliament, was disbanded. All public meetings of more than 3 people were banned except for funerals. Political speech and gatherings were also prohibited. In December, Army Security General Jun Do-hwan seized power, with the acting president serving as a figurehead. Jun extended martial law over the entire country and sent police squads to homes of pro-democracy leaders and student organizers. Throughout the spring semester of 1980, students at Cheonam University in Gwangju protested, calling for freedom of the press, democratic elections, and an end to martial law. On May 15, 1980, nearly 100,000 students marched to Seoul Station. 2 days later, Jun shut down universities and newspapers paratroopers and arrested hundreds of students and political opponents. He used a division of the South Korean army that had been trained and under the joint control of the US Army, by the way. The next day, hundreds of students went to the front gates of the closed Chatham University, where they were attacked by paratroopers. The students marched downtown and attracted a crowd of over 2,000, prompting the arrival of about 700 more paratroopers who bludgeoned students and passerby to death. The first victim was a deaf man, uninvolved in the protests. In what would come to be known as the Gwangju Massacre, 3,000 additional paratroopers would be sent in, who killed nearly 2,000 people with clubs and bayonet stabs. The South Korean government would say only 170 people died, and people who disputed the death toll faced arrest. In 1985, an eyewitness account of the incident was published by anonymous writers using a famous writer's name. The publisher of Gwangju Diary, Beyond the Death, Beyond the Darkness of Age, was imprisoned, and hundreds of thousands of copies of the book were secretly distributed despite being banned. Across the Yellow Sea, China was evolving and reaching new heights. Its population hit 1 billion in 1980. Just 1 year later, the one-child policy had been introduced as a temporary measure, with the official decree stating, in 30 years, when the problem of the population that is serious at present has been mitigated, the government could adopt a new policy. Single-child homes were given benefits like longer maternity leave, while homes that broke the policy were fined, and many women were subjected to forced abortions and sterilization. Millions of girls who were seen as less desirable than boys were abandoned by families who couldn't afford to pay fines. The controversial policy would be somewhat relaxed and tweaked by the mid-80s, like allowing people in rural areas to have a second child if the firstborn was a girl. But its larger implications remained a fixture of Chinese life for the next 30 years. The Chinese government later estimated 400 million births had been averted. And other things were changing. Back in 1978, the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China agreed to abandon Maoist ideological structures of the past and embrace practical changes under reform and opening, engineered by former Mao General Deng Xiaoping. The failures of China's Great Leap Forward had made the former Maoists a lot more practical. Understanding that China's development required international trade and good foreign relations, Deng set about rejecting Maoist support of global anti-capitalist revolution and isolation. For starters, he set aside maritime disputes with China's neighbors, further opened diplomatic relations with the United States, and initiated China's open door policy, allowing foreign businesses to set up in China. He began to reform state-owned enterprises in rural markets and private enterprises, which were expanded in size and scope under the new socialist market economy. In 1980, 4 cities, including Shenzhen, were designated as special economic zones with flexible market policies. Shenzhen went from an underdeveloped fishing village to a global manufacturing and shipping center. Other special economic zones would follow. Instead of giving all of their profits to the state, enterprises in these zones were allowed to keep a portion of their profits as long as they produced more than what the state required. In 1984, it went a step further. If enterprises exceeded their production quotas, they were allowed to sell their products outside the state at as much as 20% above the state price. As a result, there was a slowly growing class of wealthy Chinese, many concentrated in zones and coastal areas. There were fashion shows from international designers, celebrity visitors, and new products for purchase. The increase in wealth led to a boom in the construction industry for new homes and manufacturing, especially among farmers. Private and collective enterprises multiplied for everyday and leisure items, meaning cheap and interesting goods would come to be consumed worldwide. The continued use of state-owned enterprises meant efficient infrastructure and healthcare in the years to come. However, reform and opening also meant a small but noticeable return of narcotics trafficking and addiction, which had been virtually wiped out during the 1950s revolution. There was also a rise in criminal gangs and human trafficking. Additionally, not all of Xiaoping's policies were initially popular or believed to last. For instance, some Chinese citizens, many of them students, were protesting against Japanese business owners believed to be economically economically aggressive and invasive by 1985. There would be no turning back the clock to an isolated country, however. Even as some protested Japanese influence or influence from Western countries, others embraced the flow of alternative cultures from the new open door policy. Remarked one writer in 1985, more than 50 million people are learning English, and many more are wearing Western clothes. Among the young, the rage is disco dancing, Japanese motorcycles, fast food. The article added nearly 40,000 college students went abroad that year, with more than 15,000 going to America. Some observers speculated that China would move towards liberalism as a result of its economic expansion. Westerners theorized that if China continued to be authoritarian, innovation and economic growth would be stifled. But Deng again showed how different he was from Mao, especially when it came to intellectualism. There was high priority given to science and technology education, as well as technical training and a revival of art and literature. But of course, there were limits. Chinese owned TV stations, while teaching English and addressing social problems, also promoted nationalism and repressed dissidents. There were also eugenics propaganda that reminds me so much of America's eugenics movement.
It's a pity that not all mothers can have the baby of their dreams. Look at this woman. Why is she so unhappy? It is because she has just given birth to this deformed child. Other babies are born with damaged brains, exposed internal organs, or defective limbs. They are a burden to the family and society alike. That is why it is so important to take preventive measures against birth defects. We can produce a better race of people if each newborn is a good and healthy child.
Deng rejected party pluralism, believing it would lead to violence and disorder. This, along with the rejection of the open door policy, growing civilian desire for democracy, and alleged corruption, would come to a head in the second half of the decade. One last major event of note for early 80s China was the handover of Hong Kong. Hong Kong, around since the 3rd century BC, had come fully under British control along with other Chinese territories in 1898, with that control set to expire in 99 years. In 1982, UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher visited China, initially hoping to continue significant control over the territory even if China received legal sovereignty. The UK claimed that Hong Kong wouldn't be able to survive without it, which China rejected as bullshit. Thatcher later claimed that Deng said he could take Hong Kong by force if he wanted, saying, "I could walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon," to which she responded, "There is nothing I could do to stop you, but the eyes of the world would know what China is like," which is rich, coming from the Prime Minister of the colonizing ass UK. The nations eventually settled on a principle of one country, two systems in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, agreeing that Britain would give Hong Kong back to China in 1997 and that Hong Kong would continue operating in a capitalist economy and residents would continue to have rights to speech, press, assembly, and religious belief, among others, at least until 2047. The UK, like many European countries, was reckoning with its colonialist actions. Conservative or Tory member Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979 and was extremely ideologically similar to Reagan and American conservatism.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
Thatcherism involved the deregulation of businesses, privatizing services, shifting the tax burden from the rich to the poor, protecting Western imperialism, and stamping out anti-communism and cutting government funding for the poor. That last one is why she was called Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher, seeing as during her time as Secretary of State for Education in the 70s, she eliminated a program that provided free milk to all children under 11. And like Reagan and America, the Iron Lady's actions contributed towards a larger realignment of British life towards neoliberalism. So what was the UK dealing with? In 1981, a 17-year-old New Zealand teenager named Christopher Lewis fired a gun at Queen Elizabeth II when she was visiting London. The royal family covered up the incident, not wanting to inspire copycats or provoke anti-imperialist criticism. There was also an uptick in Irish Republican Army action, which since 1919 had been on a crusade to halt British rule in Northern Ireland. In 1960, 1969, two factions emerged in the IRA, both wanting British withdrawal, but disagreeing on how to go about it. The officials advocated for peaceful methods, while provisionals advocated violence, and their campaign over the following decades would lead to 1,800 deaths, including 600 civilians. They set off multiple bombs in the 70s, even killing a cousin of the Queen in 1979. A 1983 car bomb outside of a Harrods department store would kill 6, with the IRA Army Council insisting they had not authorized the attack. This showed the growing divide among the IRA factions and the drawback of a cell system in which units could become virtually autonomous from the rest of the organization and operate at their own discretion, a theme in future terrorist attacks across the globe. Beginning in 1981, there were a series of hunger strikes led by imprisoned Irish Catholic provisional Bobby Sands, who was serving 14 years for firearms possession. His protest for better treatment of political prisoners lasted for 66 days before his death. Along with making 5 demands, Sands and other participants wanted the state to recognize them as political prisoners, not as criminals, to which Thatcher said, "We are not prepared to consider special category status for certain groups of people serving sentences for crime. Crime is crime is crime. It is not political." During the hunger strike, despite being imprisoned, Bobby was elected to a vacant seat in British Parliament. When he died, riots ensued and over 100,000 attended his funeral. Thatcher said, "Mr. Sands was a convicted criminal. He chose to take his own life. It was a choice that his organization did not allow to many of its victims." 6 more IRA and 3 Irish National Liberation Army members would die from the hunger strike, leading to international criticism of Margaret Thatcher. She also saw increased support from her party and those leaning towards it. In October 1984, the Provisionals bombed the hotel where Thatcher and other members of her cabinet were staying.
Prime Minister herself only narrowly escaped injury. Her bathroom was wrecked by the blast, but in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, she remained sufficiently collected to talk to newsmen.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you, but life must go on as usual.
Thatcher escaped, but 5 people were killed and another 31 were injured. "This attack has failed. All attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail," she said. The strikes and the Iron Lady's continued refusal to give in led to an increase in IRA recruitment and activity, which would culminate in more death and tragedy in the second half of the 80s. In 1980, Southern Rhodesia officially gained independence from the UK, officially becoming Zimbabwe. Prince Charles was there to mark the occasion and Bob Marley performed. The new leader was Robert Mugabe, whose successful campaign to be the first prime minister, depending on who you ask, was allegedly rife with intimidation. In the 70s, he had cut his teeth by being a leader of the resistance against white minority rule, and he was very popular. When elected, he quickly sprung into action, notably removing statues of colonizer Cecil Rhodes and renaming roads after black people.
Those areas which are most urgent, where attention is required immediately, such as the resettlement of our displaced persons and providing them with more land, which we are doing, getting schools back into function, building more schools, repairing those which were damaged, more hospitals, repairing more those which were damaged, and extending the services in that way. This is what we are doing, and it's being done quite fast.
In 1982, Mugabe deployed North Korean-trained troops to crush an insurgency by people loyal to an old rival in the resistance movement, Joshua Nkomo. Between 10 and 20,000 people were killed, many of them civilians of a particular group, the Ndebele. Many people were raped and brutalized. Mugabe had opponents in various groups executed or arrested, many of them in a minority group, members of the clergy or judiciary, or members of the independent news media. He also expressed a desire to turn Zimbabwe into a one-party state. He talked about implementing socialist policies, but his budget remained conservative, and he greatly desired foreign investment and aligned himself with America.
Here we are, a young state that yesterday was only a toddler, but today is able to do a little more than it was able to do yesterday. And this is because of the amount of assistance. I think the United States contributes the largest amount towards our whole program of reconstruction and development.
Though he initially avoided Zimbabwe's underlying racial tension, by 1982, he was sure there was a growing threat of white militants backed by South African apartheid leaders. Many of the white people remaining in Zimbabwe were leaving, and a good chunk went down to South Africa. Speaking of South Africa, the 1976 Soweto uprising had caused a rift among Afrikaners, the Dutch-descended minority group who maintained power in South African politics. There were those who were leaning towards reform or even abolition of apartheid, and those who wanted an even stricter apartheid. And to be clear, by reform, I mean they wanted to admit a small and carefully chosen number of black people to the middle class. Additional concessions, like the removal of certain laws regarding separate amenities or requiring black people to carry around passbooks, were made. But apartheid was still fundamentally awful. In 1980, the African National Congress published a statement written by their imprisoned leader Nelson Mandela. The statement was carefully smuggled from Mandela's prison cell. It read, "Unite, mobilize, fight on. Between the anvil of united mass action and the hammer of the armed struggle, we shall crush apartheid." Mandela had been a political prisoner of apartheid for 16 years at this point, and his words, though few, were powerful. They also traveled worldwide.
To talk to people who want constitutional change, but I'm not prepared to talk to people who want revolutionary change.
If Mandela were to say that he wanted constitutional change?
He does not want it. He's stated it all over and over again, and he's in jail because he took certain steps that which overstepped the mark as far as legislation was concerned.
That was South African Prime Minister P.W. Botha, who in 1983 introduced a bullshit parliamentary system to reduce international criticism, satisfy white South Africans, reduce internal black resistance, and form relations with other black countries. The Reagan administration worked closely with Botha, and throughout the first half of the 80s, Reagan said he would veto any congressional attempts to levy sanctions on South Africa. Reagan also portrayed Botha as a moderate who was making good and impactful changes to South Africa. But this was a lie. Reforms like the Tricameral Parliament were not good. Most importantly, the Tricameral Parliament would further divide the racial groups. 178 seats of the Assembly would be reserved for whites, 85 seats of the House of Representatives would be for colored people, and 45 seats of the House of Delegates would be reserved for Indians. None would be reserved for blacks. This reflected the South African food chain. At the top were whites, then Indians or Asians who would come to South Africa as 342 indentured servants in 1860, then coloreds, aka mixed race people, and then black people, who were then further divided among language and culture. The proposed parliamentary system would create different houses of the government that essentially kept power concentrated among the white group. In response, hundreds of women's, student, church, sport, and trade union groups loosely formed the United Democratic Front, warning that UDF unites, apartheid divides. They told people not to vote on the tricameral parliament proposal, which still passed. Meanwhile, right-wing Afrikaners broke away from the National Party to form the Conservative Party, wanting to go back to an even worse form of apartheid. The rise in civil unrest and coordinated action led to increased violence from the government, who eventually declared a state of emergency throughout the whole country in 1985. The apartheid debate would be a main feature of 1980s discourse worldwide, especially back home in the States, where the divestment movement was looming. Meanwhile, in Cuba, 1980, the country was 18 years under a U.S. embargo that impacted its economy. Even still, the nation helped build infrastructure and support allied nations. For example, Fidel Castro was 5 years deep in supporting a burgeoning communist-aligned movement in Angola. The People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola were fighting against Western-backed Angolans and apartheid South Africa, and the war would continue for the entire decade thanks in large part to the military aid of Castro. Cuba was also a vocal opponent of apartheid. In May 1980, Castro announced in a speech that those who have no revolutionary genes, those who have no revolutionary blood, we do not want them, we do not need them. In the wake of Cubans trying to seek asylum in Venezuela in the late 70s, Castro made a sudden reversal of anti-immigration policy. He told Cubans that anybody who wanted to leave could go, giving them the freedom to exit at Mariel Port. They would be leaving behind mandatory Russian language courses in school, economic subsidization by the Soviet Union, and free college and health care. Cuba had a large population of scholars, scientists, and doctors, as well as one of the highest literacy rates in the world. Despite this, nearly 125,000 Cubans, many of them young, adult, blue-collar men from 20 to 34 years of age, would take the opportunity to leave over 5 months. Some wanted to see family, others were drawn to American materialism and culture, and others didn't wish to conform to Cuba's egalitarian way of life.
So many boats were coming in that the Coast Guard began ordering them to anchor offshore. There simply was no more room at the dock. New arrivals waited in near 90-degree heat, waited behind the boatloads being processed before them.
They hopped on commercial fishing vessels, speedboats, anything to make the journey to Florida. Others were picked up by Cuban Americans wielding boats from Florida. They were also joined by thousands of Haitians who had been arriving by boat since at least 1972. President Jimmy Carter, who hadn't yet lost the election, announced in June that he would welcome the refugees with open arms, even establishing a program that granted temporary status to Cubans and Haitians who could get asylum assistance. This, of course, gave his political opponents more ammo. Seeing that Carter would be welcoming to refugees, Fidel was alleged to force out mental hospital patients, political opponents, LGBTQ people, sex workers, and convicted criminals in a dual attempt to ease budgets and get rid of undesirables, or escoria, aka scum. Castro said in a speech that the U.S. was doing an excellent sanitation job for us. These Cuban exiles, known as Marieltos, were characterized as different from earlier waves of Cuban immigrants. For starters, Marieltos were often darker. Second, the fact that many of the criminals had been convicted of crimes that were not actual crimes in America didn't matter. They were all considered criminals. Lastly, because of the addition of LGBTQ and sex worker exiles, they were considered to be immoral. Carter ordered the U.S. Coast Guard to seize boats. The Coast Guard took 1,400 vessels, but many more slipped through their fingers. Carter eventually negotiated an end to the Mariel boat lifts, but the event would continue to divide and pose new problems well into the Reagan presidency. In December 1984, Castro agreed to take back 2,700 undesirables in exchange for America resuming the processing of visa applications of Cuban immigrants, but this would ultimately fall through, and the issue was a hot-button political topic in the mid-80s. American media claimed that the Mariel boat lift was proof that Cuba's revolution was a failure, despite the millions who remained on the island and supported Fidel's regime. The media also called the Cubans refugees, which didn't fit international standards of the word.
We are now facing another aspect of the originality of the Cubans and of Castro. Name me another communist leader who says to his people, if you don't want to stay, you can go. And they are going. Or, from our perspective, coming.
Florida, long a conservative state, saw a host of outraged politicians, journalists, and commentators discussing the crimes of Mariel Cubans, as well as the alleged tax consequences. At least 60 to 80,000 of the Mariel Cubans permanently stayed in southern Florida. Published the South Florida Sun-Sentinel in 1985, on any given day, there are 350 to 400 Mariel Cubans in Dade County jails, according to a recent report by the Dade-Miami Criminal Justice Council. This year alone, the county will spend more than $6 million to house those criminals. The State Department of Corrections will shell out another $6 million to house Mariels convicted of felonies in Dade. Despite the majority of the Mariel Cubans settling peacefully into their new upended lives, the fear of Cuban criminals coming from the Mariel boat lift was stoked by 1983 Scarface and news coverage like this.
He says, the 11 years I was in jail had a lot to do with it. I know what it is to be hungry. I know what it is to be punished. I know what it is to be killed, or to have to kill. Were you afraid of freedom in this country? That goes without saying, because after 11 years behind bars and then out on the street, it's like you've been dead and then born again. It is a typical story for so many Mariel refugees, arriving alone, not a penny in their pockets, their only skills the ones they learned in jail. Some of them took to their old ways, creating a fear in South Florida that grew out of violence. September 12th, 1981, a Miami police officer is shot dead. The gunman, Jorge Martinez, is from Mariel. September 13th, a robbery at a Burger King. A store clerk pulls out a can of mace. The robbers shoot her dead. The gunmen are from Mariel. February 2nd, 1982, Sergio Ortega Rojas hijacked an Air Florida jet with 77 aboard back to Cuba. His home port, Mariel.
Haitians were also treated with hostility due to racism and HIV stigma. As we'll find out in the next few episodes, Miami's changing demographics would impact the city in more ways than one. In August 1983, the new prime minister of a small Caribbean island spoke at Hunter College in Brooklyn, New York. The Reagan administration was pissed and pressed, labeling the prime minister's government as a brutal group of leftist thugs. Maurice Bishop, a 39-year-old with Marxist-Leninist leanings, had big plans for Grenada through his People's Revolutionary Government. Regarding the Monroe Doctrine, he told the crowd, "They like to talk a lot about backyard and front yard and lake. Well, Grenada ain't nobody's backyard and ain't a part of nobody's lake." Just 2 months later, the young leader would be dead. Before his New Jewel Movement party overthrew the previous prime minister in 1979, Grenada had an unemployment rate of 20%, one of the lowest rates of gross domestic product per capita in the region, and widespread poverty. Mind you, this had been after vast improvement by Eric Gary, who in 1951 had led a revolution against the reigning plantocracy. But the island still relied mainly on agricultural exports like sugar, cocoa, banana, and mace, and had a small and ineffective airport that didn't help the poor tourism industry. So, as prime minister, Bishop had rival political parties banned, suspended the constitution, and didn't hold any elections. He also rejected a state monopoly on ownership like in Cuba, instead pursuing a mixed economy with the state sector dominant and in charge of planning. Bishop's goals were to combat poverty, educate the population, improve infrastructure, diversify the economy, build a manufacturing base, and boost tourism. To go about this, Bishop had income tax abolished for 30% of the lowest paid workers. Even while cutting taxes, Bishop raised public spending on programs and infrastructure from 38.7% to 52.7%. Everyone was provided free medical health care, including dental and optical. University scholarships were doled out. School uniforms and books were free. There was a literacy program and a program for teachers to travel to people's homes. Bishop was also a strong ally to Grenadian women, outlawing sexual exploitation of women in exchange for work. Equal pay for equal work was established. And coolest of all, mothers were guaranteed 3 months maternity leave, 2 of which were paid, plus their jobs were held until their return. Grenada established a national transportation service and a marketing and national import board. The Grenada International Airport was well underway by 1983, and like many of Bishop's infrastructure projects, was assisted by Cuban construction workers. Cuba's support also came with defense, as America would have invaded sooner if not for the presence of Cuba's military. Maurice Bishop did a lot of great things for Grenada, especially considering the circumstances. Ultimately, the New Jewel movement would not be able to build a self-sufficiency that would keep it safe from the global economy and the predation of international markets. Basically, it still relied too much on agriculture and exports, which stagnated. Tourism didn't grow because American propaganda targeted the island. Reagan administration was extremely hostile over the international airport and rejected attempts by Maurice Bishop and the People's Revolutionary Government to normalize relations. Because the country received Soviet funds, it was falsely argued by Reaganites that Grenada was just a Soviet plant and not an indigenous revolution. When Grenada supported the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the country was further maligned as a puppet state. Unfortunately, the international recession of the early 80s impacted Grenada as well as its communist allies, and by 1983, the revolution was losing popularity. Bishop himself was still popular among the people, but not among those in the New Jewel movement who didn't believe he was radical enough. After Bishop rejected joint leadership with Bernard Cord, he was placed on house arrest, freed by the people, and then assassinated by soldiers on October 19th. In the ensuing chaos, Reagan conveniently enacted Operation Urgent Fury to mobilize Marines for an invasion, claiming that multiple Caribbean nations in the vicinity had requested help and that Cubans were about to occupy the island.
And Cuban ammunition was found, as well as communications equipment. It was all there in such quantities that the Americans believed this to be the makings of a full-scale military base. These are the weapons which Mr. Reagan says turned a friendly island paradise into a Soviet-Cuban colony, being ready to export terror and undermine democracy.
The quick 4-day victory excited Americans who were anti-communist and signaled to skeptics of Reagan's Central American policy that there was more to come, like a possible direct invasion of Nicaragua. Wrote Stephen Kinzer, an orgy of self-congratulation followed the triumph. A total of 8,612 medals were awarded to participants, most of them to desk officers who never came within 1,000 miles of the island. To add legitimacy to its invasion, which even UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had warned against, the Reagan administration produced a letter allegedly signed by the Governor General Paul Scoon begging for intervention. The rub? The letter had been written in Washington and backdated and delivered to Scoon to sign after the invasion began. By the way, this is how the CIA propagandized the invasion of Grenada. So what other lengths was Reagan willing to go to in the name of American democracy, if not just plain old lying? Nicaragua experienced a revolution in 1979 that ousted a repressive US-based family dynasty that had existed since the 30s. The leftist Sandinistas took control, with Daniel Ortega winning a free and fair election in 1984. Nicaragua was also closely allied with the communist bloc, particularly Cuba. Ronald Reagan called the election a sham and threw his support behind the Contras. With cocaine money and later American aid, they set up bases in Honduras with the goal of launching cross-border attacks to destabilize the Sandinistas. Contras bombed and attacked tobacco farms and other locations of economic interest so that the Sandinista government could not claim any successes. Reagan called the Contras freedom fighters who were battling the dangerous and pernicious threat of Soviet Union communism in our backyard. Congress disagreed and passed legislation in 1982 to restrict the CIA and the Department of Defense from giving money to Contras explicitly for overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. Still, the attacks didn't stop. Various peace activist groups visited the site of a 1983 tobacco farm blitz and noticed the Contras didn't try to attack. Said one anthropologist who made the trip, "If all it takes to stop this killing is to get a bunch of Americans down here, then let's do it," before calling for 1,500 American volunteers to take the trip with him. This attitude gave way to the Witness for Peace program, in which Americans held vigil in affected areas of Nicaragua to stop further violence. Other Americans visited and returned to the States to bear witness to America's role in the Contra-led violence against the Nicaraguan people and the Sandinistas. Banana republics had long been exploited in the 20th century, and there were regular direct military actions by the US government with little resistance. But in the 1980s, after the fallout of the Vietnam War, many Americans didn't care much for the idea of fighting the Cold War in third world venues. Reagan's solution came to be regarded as low-intensity warfare, in which generous economic aid would be given for friendly, read non-leftist regimes, while politically and economically isolating the unfriendly ones. Speaking of economic isolation, Reagan also used this tactic when he made a trade embargo against Nicaragua in 1985, further weakening Sandinista leadership. Reagan also used proxies like the Contras to carry out attacks that could fly under the international radar. Low-intensity warfare uprooted lives and left a trail of dead bodies in Guatemala, Honduras, and other Central American countries. Consider this: the rise of warfare and instability due to American-funded violence meant a rise in refugees fleeing to America. Between 1981 and 1990, roughly 1 million refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala alone were reported. As discussed by historian Bradford Martin, if the United States granted political refugee status to these Central Americans, it would mean admitting that the US-funded right-wing governments were dangerous and inhumane, very much undermining the image of benevolent US aid. So instead, these people were designated as unworthy economic refugees and condemned to deportation, violent reprisal, and often gruesome executions for having fled their home countries in the first place. Some religious Americans, like a Quaker goat rancher named Jim Corbett in Tucson, Arizona, felt compelled to offer sanctuary to refugees, despite it being a felony. He eventually helped coordinate an underground system of support and safe places for Central American refugees. Sanctuary movement activists like Corbett also dispersed information about the horrific realities of life in Central America and Reagan's role in them. Of course, not all groups displaying Central American solidarity were religious. Whole cities, at least 12, including Santa Fe and Los Los Angeles established themselves as sanctuary locations that would not mobilize local law enforcement to assist the INS. The Secular Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, or CISPIS, flourished, getting 525 chapters across the states by 1988. Attempting to expose murders and violence by a right-wing Reagan-backed army in El Salvador, CISPIS had its first large-scale demonstration in 1982 on the White House lawn, attracting over 23,000 protesters. The triggering event was the 1981 Mazote Massacre, in which roughly 1,000 civilians were murdered by the Salvadorian army. Reagan had claimed that there was no war crime and that El Salvador was making new progress in human rights. CISPIS also brought refugees to tour the country, speaking to labor unions, church groups, and colleges. Sanctuary and solidarity activists also served the important function of pressuring Democrats to break the bipartisan consensus on Central American policy. All of this led to a little scandal we'll return to in episode 7. Let's just say it's too bad that in June 1984, the Supreme Court ruled that presidents can't be sued for their actions in office. Meanwhile, in Liberia at the top of the decade, long simmering tensions and an imbalance of power exploded between native Liberians and Americo-Liberians who immigrated to the area in the Back to Africa movement of the 19th century. Liberia would spend the 20th century financially indebted to Firestone Tire Company and the U.S. government, as well as being underpaid for its resources. In turn, leaders of Liberia were loyal to U.S. interests. Enter Americo-Liberian President William R. Tolbert in 1971, who was welcoming to China the Soviets and Cuban ambassadors. He was pro-Palestine, officially announcing that he was cutting ties with Israel in 1973, and he was also supportive of America during the Vietnam War. By 1980, though Americo-Liberians and indigenous Liberians were integrated by this point, the minority Americo-Liberians had too much political power and were not willing to share it. This issue was exploited in April 1980 when there was a bloody coup and William Tolbert was killed. Over a dozen family and cabinet members were similarly executed, and political power was restored to a faction of indigenous Liberians. The coup was led by Samuel Doe, who helped found the People's Redemption Council to run the country. Despite the violent way Samuel Doe came to power, the PRC was considered an ally of the United States in the Cold War against communism and received aid from the Reagan administration. Doe was repressive in media, violent towards specific ethnic groups, and corrupt. In 1985, the PRC held elections because an embarrassed United States requested it. The elections were rife with fraud, but American officials concluded the election was imperfect, but at least it was a movement towards democracy. Liberia would remain politically unstable, and America's support of the corrupt Samuel Doe will continue to be an issue into the second half of the decade. Despite the ongoing criticism of his foreign policy, Reagan's anti-communism stance remained strong in the first half of the decade, and it was supported by most Americans who engaged in politics. Reagan rejected détente and emphasized that he would refuse to negotiate in substantive arms negotiations. The invasion of Grenada was just one component of the ongoing Reagan doctrine, in which Reagan supplied overt and covert aid to anti-communist resistance movements across the globe. This was an ongoing trend of U.S. military intervention and sales, with, for example, the New York Times reporting in 1981 that America had supplied $47.7 billion worth of arms, equipment, and advice to Middle East nations in the previous decade. So it's no surprise that the incentive to beef up military innovation and spending kept growing. In 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which critics later called the Star Wars program. The grand plan was for both America and the Soviet Union to erect an X-ray/laser shield in space that would de-incentivize both sides to acquire nuclear weapons. The Soviets rejected this proposal, saying that the SDI would simply lead to a race to create ground-based missiles. They also didn't want to spend any more of their dwindling money on paying for the damn thing, which wasn't even guaranteed to work. They also didn't trust Reagan, whose 1983 decision to deploy the Fleet X-83-1, the largest naval exercise to date in the North Pacific, made Soviet leaders think that the United States was preparing a direct direct preemptive attack. The Soviet Union's limited funds and attention were also tied up in its poor choice to invade Afghanistan, trying to stamp out a united solidarity movement of over 700,000 people striking against communism in Poland, and trying to keep up with Reagan's promise to outspend Soviets for worldwide influence. Reagan had introduced the Teacher in Space Project in 1984 as just one of many ways to increase American interest in STEM and appear superior to other space programs. One specially selected teacher would join an official space shuttle due to take off in 1986. But back to the Soviet Union. While they floundered from citizen unrest and dwindling coffers, they were still viewed as a significant threat and called the Evil Empire by Reagan in March 1983. Their reputation took a further hit that year when they shot down a Korean airline flight that accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace in August. The attack killed all 269 passengers and crew members aboard, which Reagan exploited immediately as an act of barbarism and inhuman brutality. And Soviet leaders denounced as an American conspiracy. The next month, the Soviet Union's early warning nuclear system was triggered due to a system malfunction. Imagine how different shit would have gone for the rest of the decade if the guy manning the system actually reported the warning and helped kick off a nuclear war. 2 months later, on November 20th, roughly 100 million Americans were scared shitless by a little TV movie named The Day After, making it one of the most watched television events at the time.
I don't believe this is happening.
We have a massive attack against the U.S. at this time. ICBMs. Over 300 missiles inbound now.
Either we fired first and they're going to try to hit what's left. But they fired first and we just got our missiles out of the ground in time.
This is not an exercise.
Second takes you beyond imagining, beyond tomorrow, and into the day after.
For weeks before airing, commentators wondered if the movie would be anti-Reagan propaganda, too scary for children, and/or too controversial. One of the movie's actors called the movie unusually disturbing and urged parents to keep young children from watching it while preparing to answer questions from older children. The movie terrified advertisers. Reagan, who had been shown the film in advance, wrote in his diary, "It's very effective and left me greatly depressed. So far, they, ABC, haven't sold any of the 25 spot ads scheduled, and I can see why. Whether it will be of help to the anti-nukes or not, I can't say. My own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent and to see that there is never a nuclear war." The ABC Sunday night special told the story of a small group of Kansas survivors grappling with life after a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The movie definitely impacted Americans who were already dealing with worsening Cold War anxiety, while pissing off those who saw the film as Soviet propaganda. Those people probably enjoyed 1984's Red Dawn, a patriotic film depicting an America abandoned by its allies and invaded by Soviets and Cubans, but thank God they had Patrick Swayze and that other guy, what's his name? Charlie Sheen.
This is the emergency broadcast system. We are under attack by conventional forces of the Russian army. It is believed the lead waves were disguised as commercial charter flights. Communications have broken down with other parts of the country. Large areas of the Midwest may have been overrun.
I know who all of you are. They're looking for you.
By the way, that was the first movie to ever be released with the new PG-13 rating. Many people for the first time were beginning to pay attention to the concept of a nuclear winter, or the devastating environmental effects that would happen after the widespread firestorms triggered by nuclear war. The concept itself had not emerged until the early 80s, more than 40 years after America dropped 2 atomic bombs that caused widespread damage to Japan. The ongoing tensions about a possible nuclear showdown were palpable, not just for Americans. Western Europeans, closer to Americans in ideology, but closer to Soviets in location, were particularly worried. Over 1 million people demonstrated against nuclear weapons at a march in London in October 1983. And the next month, 550,000 marched in The Hague, in Holland's largest nonviolent movement. Meanwhile, the American Nuclear Freeze campaign was also heating up. In 1980, an American peace activist named Randall Forsberg published the Call to Halt the Nuclear Arms proposal. She and other peace activists helped bring different groups together to try to convince both the United States and the Soviet Union to stop building more nuclear weapons. The call attracted many peace organizations, politicians, scientists, and public intellectuals, who in turn attracted everyday people. Journalist Jonathan Schell published a series of anti-nuke essays for The New Yorker that became the best-selling The Fate of the Earth, an important pillar of the Freeze movement. Another important pillar were the dozens of Freeze protests in the early 80s that attracted thousands, and in one case, 1 million people. In March of '84, in an unexpected move that calmed cautious voters, Reagan gave his Jim and Sally, Ivan and Anya speech, in which two couples, one Russian, one American, had similar lives that would be impacted by a nuclear war. It was a sign that things were possibly changing, wrote Reagan in his diary. The speech was carefully crafted by all of us to counter Soviet propaganda that we are not sincere in wanting arms reduction or peace. It was low-key and held the door open to the Soviets if they mean what they say about having peace to walk in. In August 1984, Reagan was heard saying, "My fellow Americans, I am pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes," while testing out a microphone before a speech. Though many took the joke as a joke, for those anxious about a nuclear war, it was not funny. In 1985, the Pentagon officially accepted the theory that an atomic war would cause a nuclear winter, but hostility remained. During February's State of the Union address, Reagan announced his plan to supply aid to anti-communist forces everywhere in the world to overwhelm the influence of the Soviet Union. Literally the next month, the Soviet Union inducted a new and ideologically different leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. 8 months later, he and Reagan met for the first time. And in the background of all of these global issues, there was the dawn of the AIDS crisis. The virus, though often referred to as the gay plague at the time, had unknowingly been around for decades when it was first reported on by the Center for Disease Control in 1981.
At the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
Violent homophobia kept many governments across the world from caring until it was too late. In America, by the mid-'80s, when reliable tests were first available, over 15,000 people were already dead. Unfortunately, early attempts to mitigate the spread of HIV/AIDS took place at the local level, charging their local municipalities with discrimination. Some gay activists protested measures that shut down bathhouses, for instance. Meanwhile, Reagan and the federal government did worse than nothing. They perpetuated homophobia that put millions at risk. Take this October 15, 1982 White House press conference featuring Press Secretary Larry Speaks.
Over a third of them are dumb. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wonder if the president is aware of it.
I don't have it, or you? Do you?
You don't have it.
You can get a longer, in-depth conversation about HIV/AIDS in this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, though we will be discussing it at several points throughout the rest of this series. So, the flippant and downright attitude towards the physical and emotional safety of others continued to be a theme of the Reagan presidency. Another notable example was in 1985 when the US didn't sign the UN treaty banning torture. We'll pick back up with 1980s global issues in episode 7, but hopefully it's already apparent how complex the world was and how it would further complicate the lives of American citizens even if they weren't aware of all the little details. On top of Reagan's foreign policy goals and struggles, the first few years of his presidency were marred by a global recession. Plus, the Reagan doctrine was expensive as fuck. Military defense spending jumped from $171 billion in 1981 to $229 billion in 1985, the highest level since the Vietnam War. Next, the ongoing deindustrialization of American cities, combined with the beginning of Chinese manufacturing for a global market, meant lagging manufacturing and global export revenue in America. And Japan at the time was also our biggest competitor and one of our biggest investors. All of this would factor into arguments about Reaganomics. In the next episode of Lexual Does the 80s, it's a new day, according to Reagan. But who was benefiting from that new day? That's right, we'll be talking about the rich, the poor, and American greed, 80s style.